Talking History. I'm Andrea Herzog, here with Frank Gerstenecker, former city manager of the City of Troy. How did you get the job as city manager for the City of Troy?
Well, I followed the advertisement in the International City Management Association newsletter of job postings, and I applied. I thought it unusual, however, that my hometown, where I was born and raised, is Troy, Illinois. And so I looked at this, I thought, Troy, Michigan, where is this Troy, Michigan? At the time, I was the city manager of a community in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. So I applied, and they asked me to come for an interview. So I flew in, was interviewed on a Saturday afternoon, and turned around and flew back to the Upper Peninsula. And they called me and offered the job. And so I was a competitor among many other applicants, of course, at the same time. So that's how I got the job.
What years did you serve as city manager?
I arrived in February of 1970, and I retired the end of January in 1996.
How many people lived in Troy when you first moved here?
I think the population for the 1969 or 70 census was 39,000 people.
What was the area like?
Well, the area was mostly undeveloped and open, much farmland. Black Angus cattle grazed at the southwest corner of Coolidge and Long Lake Road. There were no overnight lodging facilities in Troy at the time. When I was coming to look for housing, I either had to stay in Birmingham or a small place just north of Troy in Rochester. So it was very, very much vacant and open land.
What was the attitude of the community?
The attitude of the community was very far future-looking. There was a lot of visioning going on at this time. In 1968, there was a referendum on the question of the nature of development, and that referendum indicated there would be no multiple family housing north of Big Beaver Road. And that was precipitated by what is now called Somerset Park Garden Apartments. That same landowner had purchased a lot of land north of Big Beaver up to Waddles. And we all know the Frankel Associates, and they were much involved with that. And that led to a referendum in 1968 and a complete turnover of the city council. So when I arrived, that city council was still in effect. And so there was a lot of visioning, a lot of planning. In fact, the master plan was just under revision at the same time. The first master plan was about 1965. By 1971, the second update of that was completed, along with all the technical reports regarding the engineered utilities and streets and traffic that would be required to support the kind of development that was envisioned for the future. So a lot of planning, a lot of visioning going on, and a lot of growth versus no growth attitudes in the community.
Who was the mayor when you began?
Jewel Famularo. Jewel Famularo was a local businessman. He had his own insurance agency. He was a graduate of a law school, I think one of the Michigan law schools. Very much a very nice person, just a genuinely nice person. He was on the growth side of the issues, promoting commercial, industrial development, and or at least he was labeled that. So, but a very, very nice person, a good leader. Very good parliamentarian.
What were some of the major issues facing City Council?
Well, the major issues, they were twofold. On the one hand, there was a question of planning and zoning. the question, one of the early questions was the question of rezoning where what came to be known as the Troy Hilton at Stevenson and Maple. That was all planned for industrial, and here was this commercial development that they wanted to place there. That was an issue. Another issue was the question of any multiple family north of Big Beaver, as I've indicated. That still was there. We also had a large number of houses in Troy which had failed septic systems. I think the count was something like 3,000 premises that required sanitary sewer systems. And that was a big issue for us to tackle. Another issue was that our water system wasn't very adequate. We had a fire rating investigation, which is a normal thing where people with the insurance industries come in and examine your fire department and water system and so forth. And the water system completely failed. So in those first 5 years of my administration, my management here, we installed about somewhere around 60 to 70 miles of sanitary sewers throughout the community. And we installed about 50 to 55 miles of water transmission mains, huge mains, to transport water across the community. And that system required a lot of visioning as to how much development was going to be demanding water, and of course sewer service. We also built a huge, and a lot of this was done in cooperation with Oakland County. A lot of my work was negotiating rates and contracts with the Oakland County Department of Public Works. Another large program was drainage. We had a lot of homes. When we had a heavy rainstorm at night, I would be out in the community looking for flooding and kind of cheerleading our work crews, and also worried about some of them getting caught in some of the rushing waters. But we then constructed something called the Henry Graham Drain, which is a huge drain all along the east side of Troy, from Madison Heights up into Troy. And that was all under supervision of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in terms of size and capacity. So that was done to relieve flooding and drain on the east side of Troy. So we had both these issues. We had the growth and development issues, the planning and development. On the other hand, we had to do a lot of underlying building to support the community with infrastructure that we would place underground before we placed new highways on top.
Tell us about some of the more colorful council members.
Well, I was blessed with pretty good council people. We had, I really think our city councils in those days always reached for the higher value and took the longer view. Now, that doesn't mean that they were without color. We had a lot of good times. Although we had this constant differing of opinion as to growth versus no growth, and there was a 4-3 back and forth on that issue among the 7 members. They never lost respect for each other. They could still socialize together, and they could kid back and forth. I remember one night we had a letter, and what I would do with the agendas, I'd always make sure that something that was positive would be the last item on the agenda. We had this letter from a lady from, Birmingham or Bloomfield, suggesting that Big Beaver Road could really have a more appropriate name than Big Beaver. It should have some name like Kresge Boulevard or something like that. So, and incidentally, the Kresge Company was located in Troy at that same time. The groundbreaking was in January before I took office in February, to put some more time on this. But anyway, so that was the item on the agenda. And they were kidding each other about, well, wait a minute, it would have to be something like Famularo Freeway, because the mayor's name. Another one said, well, we call it Frankel Freeway. And I said, we call it Gerstenecker Street. I said, oh no, it couldn't be Gerstenecker Street. It would have to be Gerstenecker Straße, because Gerstenecker's German, Straße meaning street in German. So anyway, we all laughed about this, and I said, no, it couldn't be Gerstenecker because the name is too long. We have a limit for the length of street name signs, and it's too long, so it wouldn't work. So we all went home. The next day on the front page of the Detroit News was a cartoon of this large beaver overlooking these commercial kinds of buildings along the street front, and he's saying, Gerstenecker Straße? Oh, so we all got a kick out of that. Another time, and talking about the more colorful council members, we had a young guy who was a public relations person from Detroit, Diesel Allison. He was just loved by the press because he always had good quotations and so forth. And the rest of the council would kid him and put him on. And another guy that was colorful was Randy Husk, and he was in the later years. Mm-hmm. He used to call himself, he said he had a non-juris doctorate, meaning the lawyer has a juris doctorate. Right. And he says he's a non-juris doctorate. And he was a very good council person, very particular with detail. Well, what I would do with his agenda, we would we'd put out these agenda explanations of topics on the agenda. And on his alone, I would put in a real outrageous course of action with a suggested resolution. And he would come to the meeting and he'd be saying, what is, I can't believe that the manager would be doing this. And everybody else is looking at him, what do you mean? What do you mean? And so we had a lot of fun with him. And he with us too. So he was probably the more funny of the council people, if they can be that way. Right.
What kind of impact did long-tenured council members like Stein and Pallotta have on the city of Troy?
I think a lot. I believe those long-tenured members of the council, and as I look back, Mayor Doyle was the mayor for 18 years, came to the office in 1974, and decided not to run again in 1992. And you should talk with Mayor Doyle. He still lives in Troy. He's an excellent spokesman for the city. Another long-term council member, in addition to Stein and Pallotta, was Peter Taucher. Peter Taucher is a very bright person. He still lives in Troy, of course. He has engineering degrees. He has law degrees, and really was the gatekeeper of city policy on growth and development. He was on for 22 years, as I recall, and from about 1968 until, what would that be, 86 perhaps. Peter Taucher was, but he still had fun. He was always the person who you could bet was going to have all the detail and would probe and didn't hesitate to ask the people proposing development to contribute more to the community to offset the impact of their development. So Peter Taucher was on for many years. Then Tony Pallotta was appointed after a real strong differing opinion in the 70s between the growth and no growth people. Tony had run before for the council and was unsuccessful. But one of the council members, and I think it was I think it was Jim Damon, I need to check my history on this, who later became lieutenant governor. left the council to go to the State House. And I think Tony Pallotta was appointed to fill his position. But he became the person who tried to be a peacemaker between these two sides, and was accepted by both sides. And so that was his early contribution. He also had good institutional memory as to what had gone in the past and how that affected the future, as did Mayor Stein. So those people made significant contribution in terms of keeping our programs focused on the purposes for which they were originally created. So.
What were the meetings like?
Well, we had a lot of issues in planning and zoning. And that always came, and it probably still does, came first on the agendas of the City Council because they were public hearings. We had so many demands that so that we didn't run until late in the morning. I think the record of the longest meeting was till 5:30 in the morning.
Wow.
But that was a budget session. And this was during Mayor Familero's leadership as mayor. And we didn't really have to go that long. They were in the midst of studying the budget. And they said, well, about midnight, I said, well, look, we have 3 other meetings scheduled, so we can continue this. They said, oh, no. Why don't you have one of your people go out and bring in some pizza, and we'll just finish this tonight. And I said, oh, my goodness. Well, they got a second breath with pizza. And so they went. And when I got home at 5:30, my wife wondered, what, are you getting up to go to work, or are you getting home? So, and it was I think that was a record-breaking meeting. But most of the meetings, we would then schedule the public hearings to no more than 4 per night. So that, and then the public hearings were booked out like 3 months in advance. So a lot of it was devoted to that. But the City Council met every week. We put out an agenda every Friday, and then later on I backed it up to Thursday so that if they wanted to have a long weekend, they could have one without waiting until the pack came out on Friday. And also my office staff had never had much of a long weekend because they were always in the clerk's office as well, putting out the agenda on every Friday. So they would meet every Monday night, and they would vote up or vote down whatever was on the agenda, or table it. And there were no study sessions in advance. If there was a large issue that needed to be discussed and deliberated further, they might meet in a special meeting on another night of the week. And perhaps they might do that jointly with the Plan Commission or the Board of Zoning Appeals or Parks and Recreation Board or others. But their Monday meetings were all action-loaded meetings. They would meet, have 30-some topics of action, vote it up or down, and go on about their business.
For our viewers, explain how the council manager form of government works.
The council manager form of government is the most predominant form of government in the country today. It works as a private corporation, if we can think about that as a model. The City Council acts as the board of directors, headed up by a president or a chairman of the board, and that's the mayor. They appoint a city manager who is the chief administrative officer of the city. The City Council has the responsibility and the duty under the city charter to enact laws and policies and regulations, to approve the annual budget, to hire the city manager and hire the city attorney. The city manager then has the responsibility of carrying out the wishes of the city council, to see that the ordinances that they adopt are enforced, to make sure the budget is adhered to, and that the finances are kept within the budget approved by the city council. Must always keep the city council informed of the financial and any other affairs of the city. The city manager has the responsibility for the appointment and supervision of all of the department heads and all of the employees. Of course, he doesn't do that directly personally, except for the department heads. He has a human resources officer who does that. So it is modeled after a democratic operation of the U.S. Corporations. It permits city council people to continue their livelihood as regular members of the community, to participate in their government, to make decisions without affecting their livelihood because they aren't relying upon their city council position for livelihood. And so that's the way it works.
Did most of the growth in Troy occur while you were city manager here?
A lot of it, yes. We were growing at a very fast rate. But we also began to be concerned about the long term of the city. When we grew, we tried through the city council's policies and the plan commission to cause the growth and development to be such that it would be long lasting and have durability. For example, to make sure that we didn't overbuild commercial retail, we would conduct and hire people to conduct disposable income studies to determine the amount of retail that the disposable income of people within the retail trade area would have to give over to the retail uses. And so much of it did occur during that time. We had, I think in the late 70s, I think our peak was about 1,700 houses built in 1 year. And that, by some city standards, I think you can find cities that grew faster than that. But we had good staff, good building officials, and good engineering officials. Can't say enough for the department heads who worked for the city and the dedication that they had during all my administration.
What were some of the major developments in Troy to occur while you were city manager?
We did talk about the Troy Hilton. We talked about the Kresge headquarters being built. And we also came to see placement on the land of the Northfield Corporate Center. That was a great cooperative effort. In the late 1970s, we embarked upon a special assessment program for all of the road system that you see there today in the area of Crooks Road near Whitechapel and along Long Lake Road. And all of the roads in that area were built with a special assessment by the owners of land. I think they had an assessment of somewhere around $9 million over 300 acres. That was a large undertaking. So that got underway. Big Beaver Corridor in 1979 went to a referendum as to the design of the road. And after that was finally settled, by the voters as to what that would look like, we began to build Big Beaver to plan its eventual construction as you see it today. And then all of the infilling occurred along there. In the mid-1970s was top of Troy, the tallest building in Troy. And then in the early 1980s, we saw what is now the Meritech. Well, excuse me, it's I don't even know the name of the building anymore. SBC, east of Livernois. We had a lot of light industrial development during those periods too, in the southern tiers of sections of Troy. One of the things that, as I recall, was we had about 17 million square foot of light manufacturing built during that period. A lot of entrepreneurial small businesses, which today should be the focus of our thoughts about how we're going to retain those and permit those to reinvigorate themselves. So yes, there was. It's hard to define all of the development because there's so much of it.
Yeah. What about the shopping malls?
The Oakland Mall was built as it is today, with the exception of Penny's. That was added after the original development. Somerset South, as we know it, was here at the time, and the Somerset North was built. We had what we thought was a tremendous vacancy rate along Big Beaver in the late 1980s, and so we recommended the creation of a downtown development authority. And the purpose of that was to provide funding for the parking decks to support the Somerset North. We had several proposals for that development over the years. We were concerned about overbuilding, always in Troy. We were concerned about building too much. And in fact, just to indicate how concerned we were, in one instance, for the northwest corner of Big Beaver and Coolidge, we had a plan submitted by Frankel Associates, and Mr. Minoru Yamasaki did the plan. Our analysis indicated that they would need 9,000 parking spaces to support the amount of commercial and office and hotel development that they were proposing. They had only indicated 3,000 parking spaces. I'm sorry, 6,000. So we looked at this, we thought, my word, this would require a variance of 3,000 spaces from our regular requirements. And so there were other proposals over the years that we looked at. But finally, in the late 1980s, out of concern for, I think we had about an 18% vacancy rate along Big Beaver Road. And out of concern for that, it was suggested to us that we create a downtown development authority. We investigated and recommended to the city council that they do that. They did, and then that provided the funding for the Somerset North. And on that, I'd like to indicate that the test as to whether we would release the bond monies for the construction, in fact, they financed and built the parking deck. We held the bond monies until the cash flow in tax returns was great enough to 2.25 times the amount required to support the bonds. And after that test was met, the bonds were released after I had retired, incidentally. So, so it is self-supporting, and I think it was successful. And it helped also with reconstruction and the final construction phases of Big Beaver. So, yes, a lot of development occurred in those years, and it's hard to imagine because we were so busy.
Mm-hmm. How did Beaumont Troy end up here?
that's another story. We had need for hospitals in Troy, and there was a group called the Hospital Planning Council. They had certification of beds, and that was their responsibility in the metropolitan area. We always felt that a hospital should be located somewhere in the center city area, somewhere in the vicinity of the Civic Center. We thought that that was part of a downtown. Well, the Hospital Planning Council said, nope, can't justify it there, but there is a location of hospital bed need in the vicinity of DeQuinder and South Boulevard. And so we looked at that and thought, well, okay. But in the meantime, we had received suggestions from Henry Beaumont, William Beaumont, Henry Ford Hospital, and I think Madison Heights Community Hospital, that they be the ones who would develop a hospital in Troy. And so the City Council created a committee comprised of residents who were knowledgeable about health care and insurances, and we began examining these various proposals. At about the same time, we had a proposal to develop a mobile home park south of South Boulevard and on the west side of DeQuinder. Well, we started thinking about this and thought, well, maybe that'd be a good place for a hospital, because the Hospital Planning Council had indicated that there was a bed need there. So, and then finally, it just evolved that the committee recommended the City Council gave a nod to the William Beaumont Hospital, and so they bought the location where it now is, and other surrounding lands. And so that's how it came to be there.
Troy has a large amount of parkland. Were you instrumental in helping reserve this land to become parks?
Well, I had a hand in it, yes. It would be immodest of me to say that I personally did all these things, because it really is a team effort in city management. But having said that, yes, I negotiated the purchase of the Sylvan Glen Golf Course. Later in the 70s, I negotiated the purchase of what is now the Sanctuary Lake Golf Course. I bought that from an owner that was landfilling there and had it as a landfill site. We wanted that under the city's control so that we could supervise it better and make sure of the materials that went there, and then eventually use it for park purposes. Excuse me. Ernie Reschke, who was in the city assessor, came to me one day and said, you know, Mr. Coughlin has this farm at Beach Road and South Boulevard, and he's interested in somehow keeping that into one piece. And Ernie said, I think it'd be a good place for parkland. So I said I couldn't agree more. So we began discussing this with Mr. Coughlin, and of course with the City Council. And it fell into the plan that would be a good place for an outdoor education center. And so we were able to negotiate that under a land contract for several years. Then another person willed to the University of Michigan, I think, the site where the outdoor education center is located, and we were able to acquire that from that person. So those two sites came together. Other parklands that we acquired were, I have to think of the section, I think of them as sections now. 25, that's bordered on the north by Big Beaver, on the south by Maple, on the east by, I think, John R., on the west by, no, it's on the east by DeQuinder. on the west by John R., I think. Anyway, we were able to acquire some lands in there for park purposes. The place where Firefighters Park is, we were able to acquire that, and indeed, because of the stream and floodplain, we had a developer who owned that, and we were able to negotiate a transfer of development rights, because that was not developable because of the floodplain. But there were also, one of the things we used for land use control and density was sanitary sewer outlet capacity. We knew what our total capacity was, so that any parcel of land that existed at the time the plan was completed, we felt had an allocation of taps. So what we did was we negotiated with the developer to transfer those sewer taps from that location to another location. And therefore, the property became of less value, and the other property became more valuable because they could concentrate more units there. And it was along I-75, let's see, north of Northfield Parkway. So anyway, we negotiated that, acquired that, had a big barn on it, and some people had horses there. They wanted us to keep the barn because they wanted their horses to keep their horses there. It was very favorably located for them. And so I saw an emotional issue here, and I wondered, how in the world are we going to be able to ever persuade these people to discontinue this use so that we can have it for parkland? Well, about that time, we'd also negotiated, where we had a hand in helping the Kresge Foundation locate at the Brooks Farm on Big Beaver. And so we talked with those folks. They bought the barn, and they relocated it to the Brooks Farm site on West Big Beaver. And incidentally, somewhere in the archives, when I first arrived, there was a sign right in front of that old stone farmhouse. There was an original sign that said cattle crossing for eastbound Big Beaver Road, which was 2 lanes. And somewhere there is a photograph of that sign in the foreground with Saks Fifth Avenue in the background.
Oh my God. Tell us about the first planned unit development.
First planned unit development was in Northfield Hills, Corporate Center, Northfield Hills, what we then called it. And it was adopted, I think, in probably 1968 or 69, before I arrived in Troy. But shortly after it was adopted, it was a beautiful plan done by, again, Mr. Minoru Yamasaki. And shortly after the early 70s, the Chrysler Corporation that owned all of the land, and I think it was around 2,000 acres, had a downturn in the automobile industry. And their real estate division became more asset-laden, if we can call it that. And so they found they could sell off those assets and bolster the automotive end of things. In any event, they sold off land to Levitt Company, and they began to develop the R1T townhouse area. And the city council was concerned about this development now that it was no longer owned by Chrysler and in the hands of the original proponents of the planned unit development. And so they went back and annulled that ordinance, or repealed it, and so that we were back on the regular standard zoning courses again. So, in that development, it came to pass that, in fact, this is another piece of irony. Shortly after it was approved and still owned by Chrysler, 2 young men came to visit me, and this was probably 1972 or 73. One was Sidney Forbes, and the other was Maury Cohen, and they were called Forbes Cohen. and they looked like high school kids. And they were going to be the developers of the commercial area in the Northfield corporate area, and they'd already had an agreement from then Montgomery Ward to be one of the major retail stores. And they indicated that they needed to get one more, and they were going to talk with another one that they asked me to keep confidential, but quite frankly, it was J.C. Penney's. And so they thanked me for my time that day, and I thanked them for their interest in Troy, and they went about their business. Well, it wasn't long after that, and Penney's announced they were going to go into Oakland Mall. Now, so I just assumed that their plans were not going to be fulfilled. Well, as you may know, the developers of Somerset North, along with Sam Pringle, were the same two gentlemen. They came back to Troy after all those years. They were always located in the metropolitan area, but they were fine people to deal with in the development of the Northfield, I'm sorry, the Somerset North. So they first appeared in 1972, 73, and they came back 20 years later. Oh. So.
Who are some of the staff members that you remember?
Oh, let me first of all say that I inherited excellent staff when it came to Troy. Wonderful people. And I hope I don't omit anyone. But the ones I remember who were heads of departments and were very, very professional. Of course, there's Larry Kiesling. He was the planning director. Ken Courtney was the finance guy, director of finance and the city clerk. Excellent man at budgets and excellent with numbers. His management of the pension system outperformed the Dow almost every year we were here together. Then a guy by the name of Dick Graham was the city engineer and what we call director of public works. He later became the owner of Professional Engineers Associates, another Troy company. Bob Quigley was the city engineer, great guy. He was recruited out of the highway construction industry, and he knew highway construction forward and backward, and he could get more money out of the dollar. And he helped. He did a great job of, in those early years, converting the gravel roads like along Coolidge and Waddles into paved highways. And so then we had, in the building department, we had a gentleman by the name of Fred Stanley. Fred Stanley was a very no-nonsense chief building inspector, did a great job. He was succeeded by Jerry Vandenbush, also another great building department head. We had Roger Kowalski. We recruited Roger while I was here to be the head of the Parks and Recreation Department. Roger, again, a no-nonsense guy, but boy, he really, I think, was excellent in building the Troy recreation systems. He and Tom McKinney, who was the superintendent of Parks and Recreation, I remember them coming in one time and saying, "We don't have much of a budget for this. How about if we start doing some programs where the participants pay?" And I said, "You have as long as it's lawful, and you don't compete with private sector people, whatever the people want to pay for and enroll in, you can do it. If you don't get enough registration, and if the fees don't support the program, then you have to cancel it and refund the money." So they started off, and they built that program based on fees, largely. Let's see, Ernie Reschke was the city assessor, very talented guy, great sense of humor. I remember one time we were talking about, we had a water tower behind the gasoline station at the northwest corner of Big Beaver and Crooks. by what was then the old Poppleton School, what the Sandy Corporation is. And this water tower was no longer needed because we discontinued use of the well there. And we were thinking about how we could get it taken down. So Dick Graham said, well, I've talked with a resource recovery guy, salvager, and he says if it's bolted together, he can unbolt it, and he can actually take it away free. And we thought, well, we could take bids and see who would pay us most or take it away free. So next week he comes back and he says, I've looked at it and it's all riveted together. So we were thinking, well, how can we get this done? Ernie says, look, let's just fill it with helium, cut it off, and let it float to Sterling Heights. I'll never forget that. But Ernie was trained as a landscape architect. In his early years, he did many of the park designs, but he also did the assessing. But I think continues to be, but was then the most talented assessor that you could find. We had ways of assessing property that was very, very innovative. For a special assessment to the Holiday Inn, for a road going to the Holiday Inn on Rochester Court, we had residential uses, we had office uses, and we had a hotel use. And how would you then assess those people for the benefit? So we sat down and thought about this. We did something called a trip generation and distance study theory. So we went down and put traffic counters across all the driveways and across the streets. So we learned how many trips were generated by each parcel. Then we determined the distance that they would travel over the road, and we used that to arrive at factors for the special assessment. And I don't know of anybody anywhere who's ever had a more fair and equitable method. And Ernie did most of the thinking about how to get this done. So other department heads, police chiefs, had great police chiefs. First chief who was here when I arrived was a gentleman named Forrest Fisher, a very forward-looking guy for that period of time. And then, incidentally, the police department was in the first level of this building, the City Hall building, and as were all of our operations. Then he was succeeded by John Donovan. I did the testing and promoting of John Donovan, and then John Donovan was succeeded by Larry Carey, and Larry was the chief. So I only had 3 chiefs during my tenure. Let's see, I don't want to omit anyone here. The city clerk, Francis Teasdale was the deputy city clerk under Ken Courtney when I first came to Troy. And she was succeeded by Tammy Renshaw. Florence Robinson was a treasurer, a very, very stately, matronly looking lady, nice, beautiful, white hair, very well kept. But I'll tell you what, if you were delinquent in your taxes, she was without mercy. She had a high rate of collection, and she could beat the IRS to the door of anyone who had, who had overdue taxes. She was a great, great person.
Can you share with us any stories about Troy residents?
Troy is a very diverse community. And I remember one resident who remained unnamed who would come into the council meeting and complain about things because he didn't get the use of his property. He wanted to use an old home for commercial use, and it just didn't meet any of the requirements for that commercial use. So he was obviously denied and very disgruntled. But he was a person of great wealth, and his name is nowhere in the annals of development. It was just a person who. So one day he called me And I bumped into him somewhere, and I had my family with me. And he said, "My, what a beautiful family. I have a son and daughter." And he said, "We'd like you to, do you teach these children music?" And I said, "Sure. They take music in school." And he said, "Well," he said, my son plays cello for the Baltimore Symphony. And he says, I play violin." He said, "You're invited to my house with your family on Sunday afternoon for tea, and I'll play the violin." So my children, very well behaved, and they were in their, like, maybe 5 and 9 or something like that. So we went, and they just couldn't get over this gentleman, how entertaining he was. But he was very, very, very elderly, but very spry. And he's the one that tipped me off to the Coghlan property. He suggested that I buy that for myself, and that it was in trust, and that if I spoke to this trust officer, and this is where the Troy Outdoor Education Center and the Troy Farm is now. He's the person who tipped me off to this on that Sunday afternoon. And so, but a very, very unusual person. Another person who was very colorful in Troy and unusual, God rest her soul, was Annie Smith. She was a local fixture, and during the Troy celebration of the sesquicentennial, or I don't know, maybe the bicentennial, one of those big celebrations. And she was the kind that she would barge right into your office. And she was an old, long-term Troy resident. And her language wasn't always very good. So I would try to avoid hearing this bad language among my staff. And so as soon as she came to my office, the best thing I knew I could do was get her in my office and close the door. And then everybody would say, "I wonder what he's doing in there," because I never closed my office door. And the reason was so that they didn't hear all of her swearing about some neighbor or something. So one day, the crowning glory of all this is that she comes into my office and she says, "Look out your window. I have my car there." I said, "Okay." And in those days, that's where all the police cars parked, right below my window, and which is now the west entrance to the City Hall. So anyway, I went and looked out, and I said, "Oh, that's your car, the brown one?" She said, "Yes." And she said, "That's my car with my bare behind showing." And I looked, and she had taken a shag rug, had some big buttons on for her eyes and a nose, and she said, "That's my bear." Oh my. And so then a couple of weeks later through the mail, I get a photograph that she had taken in front of the Birmingham City Hall with a Birmingham police officer looking at this car with a shag rug on the trunk deck. But she was a character. And she was, you never knew when she was going to, what she was going to do next. But she added color to our days.
Tell us more about your contact with the renowned architect Yamasaki.
Mr. Yamasaki, a person that I had great respect for as an architect. He was next door, as you know, to City Hall here. He was at what is now the Ford and Earl property owned by the Troy Pension System. But Mr. Yamasaki, I had my first contact with him when we were presented the Northfield Hills corporate plan. And a very, very impressive plan. Then my second contact with him was, that I can recall, there were probably many others in between because he was doing various buildings in the city, was when we tried to acquire property from him along his Big Beaver frontage for the widening of Big Beaver in probably 1977 or 1978. That didn't go well. He didn't understand our plan and our willingness to be flexible with how much property we took from across his frontage to widen the road. And he assumed immediately that we were going to take a beautiful tree that is still there today, which is a big, huge copper beech tree. And so anyway, he first started a lawsuit against us for saying that we were improperly taking his property and so on and so forth, and, which he did not prevail in federal district court, but we then were able to take some of his property.
Were there any renovations or additions to City Hall while you were city manager?
Always. When I arrived in 1970, the City Hall was about 4 years old. So it was brand new, very nice. And the library, the original library building, was then under construction. And the bids had been let, and they were just starting to build. So I got to oversee that as well. Then in 1978, this was a very busy time, we received a 100% grant for creating jobs to add to the City Hall what was then called the Hall of Justice, which included the police wing where, let's see, who's located there now? I think you'll find the city clerk's office there, and I don't know, let's see, probably what used to be the police department, law offices, yes, and a fire department underneath. So that whole area, in fact, the back of what is now the council chambers was the original back of the City Hall. So when you walk around behind the council chambers, you're looking at what was the back of the original City Hall. So at that time, that was added on. And then we did renovation where the police department was moved out of the original City Hall building into that building, and the courts were moved. So there was renovation of the space that they left and changed into other uses. That was the first go-around. Then in the late 80s, the American for Disabilities Act, ADA, became enacted, and it occurred to us we didn't have any elevators in the building. We had to determine a way to get elevators in to get people to the second floor. So we did a renovation at that time, and also renovated the public spaces to accommodate people of disabilities. And so that was probably the mid to late 80s. And then it seemed like we always had offices being changed and remodeled and updated. So the library was added to in the early 1980s. The original library was built in 70 and 71, and then in about 1983 or 84, the addition was added. What is now the children's portion of the library was the original building, and then the rest of the adult services area was added in 1983 and 84. So.
Tell us about community visioning projects like the Troy Futures Report.
Oh, well, we saw changes coming in Troy in the late 1980s in terms of having experienced some vacancies along Big Beaver Road, and I thought it was time, and this was another opportunity to revisit not only the land use planning, but just the community view of itself that everyone had thrashed through in the late 60s and early 70s. So in the late 1980s and early 1990s, I really lost track of time because we had about 200 or 300 people working in this program. We did what we call a community visioning program, in which we asked people to come out on a Saturday morning to Larson Middle School, and where we would have a presentation by a futurist and the mayor and myself. And so we did, and we asked them if, wait a minute, I think I'm ahead of myself. The first meeting was probably held at Standard Federal, that's right, Standard Federal, on an evening meeting in which we asked people to go around and sign up for different things. We had a sign-up sheet, and so from that we developed a mailing list. And then on the Saturday morning, all day Saturday, we had a plenary session to plan a series of events to get at a vision for Troy, or the multiple visions that Troy really had. And so that was undertaken, and we thought it would take us about 9 months or a year, and it took us 18 months to get through all of it and to publish the Futures Report. And it was an interesting project because we didn't see any particular single kind of future, but multiple futures. I think my feeling was that we had as many futures in Troy as we had people, because everyone had an opportunity here, we thought, and would hope. So that's the approach we took, and so it resulted in the Futures Report of, I think, 1991 or 92.
Were you involved in any community organizations?
I was the only community organization I belonged to in terms of a service club organization was the Troy Rotary. But I was a frequent visitor or guest at almost all the Troy service clubs. And I participated in, if they had a program that involved the city, I felt that I should be there to make a presence and lend them help and assistance and advice. So, yeah, but the Rotary is the only one I really held membership in.
What were the hangouts in Troy in the 1970s? Were there any hot spots?
I think the places that I recall being places where people would go. I think the Troy Clawson Elks Club, although I wasn't a member of that group, I think a lot of Troy people went there, and still do. Another place was the Alibi Lounge. That's a permanent fixture on the landscape. It was a very Spartan building in the 1970s. It was artificial composition brick nailed on the walls, and very close to the Big Beaver, to the Rochester Road curb. And I always, and excellent food. And when I would go there, I'd always sit near the kitchen. And the reason was I always feared a truck an errant vehicle would come through the front wall. But none did, fortunately. There was also what is now called the Wagon Wheel. That has different names over the years, but that was a place that people went to along Rochester Road. And so, yeah, I think those were eateries where people would go and socialize on a regular basis. On the Maple Road side was, my goodness, I can't remember the name of the place. There was a little restaurant, almost like a diner, across from what was then the airport on Maple, west of Crooks. And that now is where Shields is located, because that owner had enough land to build what is now called Shields Restaurant, which is probably another place where people began to go after it was open. So,
how long have you and your wife been married?
Oh my goodness, the hard questions. Why don't we try 44 years?
What were her thoughts when you accepted the job as Troy City Manager?
She was very supportive, has always been supportive of whatever I wanted to do. And in fact, the decision to go into city management was made when the first summer that I met her. And she knew of that decision before we were married.
How did you and your wife first meet?
You really want to find this out, don't you?
We do. We like this.
You like this. Well, I met her at the Chicago bus station. I was an undergraduate student. I had a lapse of 6 years between high school and college when I had to go to I was invited to do military service. I call it involuntary servitude. But anyway, after that, I worked for a few years in various things, and then I went to college. And I met her. I took a job one summer when the director of a Girl Scout camp learned that I could make machinery run, and I had been a mechanic in the military. And so they invited me to be the summer handyman at the Wilmette, Illinois Girl Scout camp, Council camp in Wisconsin. And I thought, well, this is a good deal because they'll bank money for me if I stay the whole summer. I'll be able to live through the winter on the GI Bill and whatever else I can make. And so this lady, as it turned out, was the assistant director of the camp. So I went in with my Beetlebug Volkswagen and picked her up with all of her suitcases and her big trunks and all of that in my Volkswagen, and none of it would fit, almost. So that was the meeting place.
How many children do you have?
2.
And grandchildren?
1.
Do any of your children still live in Troy?
Yes, my daughter still lives in Troy, and she lives about a couple miles from us, and she's a great gal. We see her a lot and do a lot of things together. So, yes.
How have you been spending your retirement?
Oh, I have a gazillion projects going. I do volunteer training for the Michigan Municipal League. I do voluntary training in the Academy for Municipal Officials. I speak and train in 3-hour sessions on roles and responsibilities of local elected officials. I do a program on relationships between city councils and city managers. It's another 3-hour series that I do for them. These are usually weekend assignments for people who go out for the compressed weekender training in the Advanced Academy. So I do that. I also do consulting for fee through the Michigan Municipal League. That consulting involves helping city councils and village councils through recruiting processes for city managers and village managers, and sometimes department heads. I also serve on the Michigan Municipal League Foundation Board. We have just finished a $1.4 million campaign successfully to provide CDs in municipal government for elected officials. And there's 6 different CDs that we've put together for them, and it has to do with just their roles, responsibilities. It has to do with pension fund management, financial management, and so forth. We're now working on the funding of a series of works for people who wish to become involved in municipal government, to inform them. So, and these are all available through the Michigan Municipal League. And I sit on that foundation that does that. So.
Do you still follow the Troy issues?
not much. I do somewhat. You see, my problem is, when I get involved, I get very much involved, and I just feel it's other people's turn now to do things. And yes, there are things that I see and I think, well, we could have reached for a higher venue on that particular thing. And I think that's what I found with the city councils that I worked for. They always reached for the higher venue, the higher long-term value for the long-term of the community. And I'm not saying they don't try to do that today. Of course, I'm not there to see always. So, and I don't. Another reason I don't become involved is because I like work that I can take a project, finish it, go on to the next project, finish it, and then when I want to go to Florida to see my grandchild in the winter, I can do that without leaving a position that needs attention.
Is there anything that you miss from Old Troy that's gone now?
Well, no, I don't think so. I think Troy is pretty well kept. Yeah, and I think so. I don't. There's nothing I miss that has changed.
Yeah. That's good. What keeps you in Troy?
Oh well, 26 years of my life investment. I guess if I counted the times worked, it would be a lot more than 26 years because of the long days and long nights. But I think that's what keeps me in Troy. And I have a home here that I like, and my wife likes very much. I sometimes have told her that we could sell this house and get two houses, one in Florida and one in northern Michigan somewhere, but I'm suddenly admonished that that's not a good idea.
Is there anything that you love about Troy today?
I think I like the informality of the city. When I have guests coming, if they want to golf, they can golf. If they want to dine at a fine restaurant, they can do so. With us, of course. And I think it's a good place to be proud of. I think that's what I like. And quite frankly, as you get older, you begin looking about medical, have excellent medical service, and with our good hospitals. So, not that I need that, but.
What do you see for the future of Troy?
Well, I see a lot of challenge in terms of reinvigorating the small entrepreneurial business, which is light manufacturing. I see the need to begin thinking of those facilities that those businesses occupy. If I can use an analogy with the computer system, if we looked at the building and the surroundings as the hardware and become more flexible as we do the software on the interior uses, so that the interior uses drive the success of the hardware, the exterior. And if we can begin to think of it, I think, and try to couch our land use decisions based on that, I think we could help them reinvigorate themselves more. I think we could begin looking at Renaissance zones. I think that's an opportunity for us, especially in the Maple Corridor and in the first tier of sections north of 14 Mile. I think there are some opportunities there for the future. I believe the residential areas are sound. As long as we have a good school system and a good park system that attracts young people who have the energy and desire to keep the property up, I think that's important for our community. And the renewal of the taxes for the schools by a vote yesterday, I think, was forward-looking and important. And that's what I see. I see more of the continued commitment to the community through the various community groups that we have, through the library, Friends of the Library, the historical groups, the Historical Society, through all of the service clubs. We have just a tremendous momentum here, and I think it's important to keep that going and respect that and give it its recognition and its entitlement to continue to make Troy what it is.